It's time to present Scott DuPont to bring you another episode of Finance Your Movie with tips and strategies to help you get your money to tell your story. It's time!
Series 7, we're back once again. Today, I'm thrilled to have a really fun guest here. Award-winning writer, director, producer James Kicklighter, who just did The American Question. Great movie. How are you, James?
I'm great. Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here today.
Thank you so much. So we're going to get into the American question in just a few minutes, but you came from a very small town in Georgia of 150 people.
Close, 123, but yes.
My God. And now you're in LA.
And now I'm in LA. I joke that all the time that when I go home, I flip the sign back to let people know I'm home. And the same number of people approximately live on my street. So it's a remarkable contrast to growing up.
Wow. Just kind of a condensed version. Did you have a love of movies and when you're in this small town, or did you go to film school? How did you get to be a producer in LA?
Sounds like Siri was trying to intervene. So I don't know if that stumbled over. But anyway, I loved movies growing up, and as a lover of movies, I wanted to work in that industry. But obviously, growing up in a small town in South Georgia, the film industry really isn't accessible to you. So I started making high school graduation videos and wedding videos and used that money to finance my first projects. And that would have been short films, short documentaries, things like that. And I was very fortunate to get into some film festivals where I met people who were able to help me. I actually got my degree in public relations and did not get a film degree, but I was making films with the expressed intention of using that degree for things like pitching and understanding audiences and marketing. And that has ended up being a very useful toolkit to have.
And you got the best education learning in the trenches. Writer, director, producer, so you're a triple threat, but you're also an editor, right?
Yes, I do edit too. One thing about editing is that I find as a director, Sean Baker said this in his Oscar acceptance speech, which I think is very true. It's a never rewrite process for you as a director. One thing that's really important, though, is that if you find yourself unable to get it over that hill, I think it's really important to bring in outside help. And I do that on some projects too.
Awesome. So I want to, so you did some shorts, you did some music videos. I want to talk about one of your first films, either Desires of the Heart, which was your first feature, I believe,
Sure.
or The Sound of Identity. What were the budgets and how did you raise that money?
Well, both of those films were financed by producers. So in that case, it was just me being hired to direct and executing the budget that was given. For Desires of the Heart, that was under 2 million, and The Sound of Identity was under 500,000. It's a documentary, so it's a little bit less expensive to make.
So for the audience that's listening, I'd love to connect the dots. What you just said, you had done a bunch of
Mhm.
shorts. You're doing these other videography gigs. How in God's name does somebody call you up and say, "Hey, I got a $500,000. I want you to direct this movie"?
It's relationships. Over time, as you're working in the business, I was lucky enough to be doing a variety of different corporate type work to sustain my career in the early years. And that would be everything from corporate clients to some of those web videos and, high school graduation videos, wedding videos, et cetera. And over that time, I was using that money to keep making shorts and docs that were going to festivals, getting positive reviews and networking. And over that course of networking, that's really what got me to the place where I was able to transition into making those things more full time. So on Desires of the Heart, the production manager knew me when the previous director had dropped out, suggested me to the producer, and I was hired. And with The Sound of Identity, I met those producers at an event, and they thought of me when they were thinking of hiring directors for that project. And so, really, it's about people you know and the work that you're doing. And if those two things come together, it makes things a little bit easier.
So true. So true. Networking is so important. It's all about relationships. So let's and not only were you in the right place at the right time and networked, connected, but you were obviously prepared. You
You have
had
to be
those skill
prepared.
sets.
You have to be prepared because at any given moment, it doesn't matter what project it is or what you're looking to do. If someone comes to you and says, "Hey, we're thinking about you to direct something," you have to be able to be equipped to not only position yourself as the right director, but also have enough work to be able to show for it. And so, if you're doing things independently, that means doing something Wyatt was doing, making those shorts, making those docs, getting them to the right places, having the right press coverage. This goes back to the degree in public relations that I got. I think it's something that's sometimes undertaught in film schools, which is it's great if you make something, but if no one knows it exists, then you're not going to get very far. And it's very helpful when you're in those meetings and in those rooms to be able to point to that press coverage, to be able to point to positive reviews and reputable publications, not just blogs. These are things that really do matter. And if you approach your career in that way, I think in some ways it can be helpful to you to help make that jump.
So true, so true. I agree with everything you just said in terms of finding the right distributor
Mhm.
and getting it picked up, but also for those people, we live in this wonderful world where we've got SVOD, TVOD, and AVOD. So even if your film just goes to AVOD, Tubi, Plex, all these other great platforms, if you don't have some marketing, PR, it's just going to get lost with the thousands of other movies.
There's so many independent films being made these days, and so it is critical that people have awareness of that, and it's something you should build into your budgets. I think that sometimes we as independent filmmakers spend all this time and money on making the thing, then there's nothing left for publicity, marketing, all those other elements. And if you're on any of those type platforms that you just mentioned, they're not going to spend money on publicizing your project. The only ones that are going to spend money on that is when you're moving with those paid distributors. And so it's really important that you're able to have that resource available to you at the end of production.
So let's move on to your most recent film, The American Question. Um, I saw the movie. I loved it. What I loved about it, James, was that it seemed to be pretty unbiased. You try to get to the wholeness of the story about this crazy, crazy place that this country, United States of America, is. It's not quite so united anymore. And I also like the fact that the movie showed a couple of solutions and ideas to bring people together. So it had a very positive, inspiring message woven into the end of it.
Thank you. Well, in shooting it over 8 years, one thing that was
Whoa, back up. 8 years?
8 years. Yes, we filmed it over 8 years. And so
Wow.
and the great thing about doing that, I've never done a project like that before. And for the record, that's not the only thing I've made over 8 years, but this was, like a little summer camp we kept going back to. So we would film a little bit here, film a little bit there. Is that we were able to observe what other filmmakers were doing, what other television shows were doing about this topic. And that was one thing that kept coming back to me, that a lot of people were presenting just talking as a solution. And I thought that wasn't enough for our polarized moment. And so we worked with all of these regular folks across the country and then found experts to contextualize the things they were talking about, and then would have this conversation over time where we say, okay, well, what's missing here, what's something that we need to inject, what's a new element. And we were able to do that with that perspective of time. And so I'm glad you felt it was balanced, because that was really something that we wanted to do, and it was a challenge for sure.
So this was kind of your baby. You raised the money yourself?
Myself and my production partner on that, Guy Seaman, he did the bulk of the fundraising, but he really went out and we had to find investors for this project that were really aligned with it. When it comes to documentary filmmaking, that is really the critical component in the independent space. It's really finding investors that are aligned with your vision, that are passionate about the topic. In a scripted film, that may or may not be the case, right? Because it might be about the attachments and the foreign pre-sale sales and all of those elements. But with documentaries, it's really about finding like-minded individuals that are interested in investing in that. And that sometimes takes a little bit of time. Because of the nature of the film we were doing, we didn't have to raise all of that money at once, but we did it in tranches. And, Guy worked very hard on that. And it really helped us to get to the point we were at when we were finished.
So let's talk a little bit about the budget or what budget range it was, and connect the dots if you could. How did you and Guy reach out and actually get those investors?
Yeah, reaching out to investors is always a long, lengthy process. You want to have investors that are accredited, that have the financial backing. There is a legal process for that, in making sure that someone can actually invest money in that. Films are risky endeavors. And so if you're not able to have people that can afford that investment, it can become a problem for you later, depending on how things go, right? So it was really, using our various networks and tapping into different people that were passionate about this topic. And that required a lot of yeses and a lot of nos, going back and forth and trying to figure out what kind of structure made sense for those investors. And so that's something that, depending on each film, is a very different process. But in the case of The American Question, it was really Guy going through all of these different people across the country and finding like-minded individuals.
Did you on a project that's 8 years where you're fundraising over a period of time, did you ever have to go back and restructure the equity or redo agreements, or did you kind of keep on a budget and just kind of piecemeal it?
Yeah, we generally kept the structure consistent throughout the process. The only time we would have to go back and restructure a deal is if a specific investor came in with additional money. Because we did have some investors that came back when we needed more funds later, that were passionate about what we were doing, liked what they saw in the edit, and were very supportive of that. So it depends on, again, the structure of the film. But in this case, it was a mixture of those existing investors that had maybe one investment and then some that came back with additional money.
So one of the things I see about all of your films, the first two films, you were in the right place at the right time. You had the relationships. They were funded, but the American Question that you funded, I see a pattern that you have a really, really solid veteran award-winning team. So I'm assuming that's part of your business plan. How important do you think that step is before filmmakers go out there and start trying to raise money? Having that team.
You build that team over time. And I've been lucky enough to be doing this long enough that I've been able to build a network of people, not just on the financial and distribution side, but also creatively, that I trust. And we have a very collaborative process. Having that experience does help quite a bit with investments, because they know that's going to be in trusted hands. When you have a more newbie group, a kind of green group, it's a little bit harder to do that because an investor, especially in an independent film, might not trust that they can get it over the finish line. And so one thing that's always been very valuable for me is understanding what I'm good at, what I'm bad at, and where I need help, and trying to find those individuals that fill in those gaps. And ultimately, to get to that point, as a director and producer, you've got to do two things. One, you're not always going to have all of that work at the beginning to get those people. So if you don't have that work, you have to be able to convince them of your vision. And that usually requires having a very clear creative roadmap, and also usually having some sort of financial backing to do it. And so it's sometimes a chicken and egg question, right? Because people wonder this when they're first starting out, how am I going to get those people? And that really ultimately belongs to you as the filmmaker to be able to convince those folks that have more experience that you have the vision to execute.
I want to circle back real quick a little bit to your partner was Guy, who was helping you raise the money.
Yes, Guy primarily did most of the fundraising, and I did most of the creative on the film. Yes.
So I'm guessing he was another producer.
Yes.
Were you guys friends, or how did you guys team up? Because it always seems to be very effective if you're able to bring on one other partner or producing partner. So it's not just you, the lone Indian, going out there raising the money all by yourself. Talk about that dynamic of both of you kind of reaching out to people.
Of course. Well, in the case of the American question, Guy came to me with the concept initially after I worked on Hillary Clinton's campaign in 2016. He had also worked on that and had this idea to write a thesis paper about American division and realized that no one would read it if he did that. And so he started reaching out to people about what if I made this into a film. And a producer named Tara Ansley, who knew both of us, reached out to me and said, hey, there's this guy that wants to make this film. I think that you guys would be a very good match. And so that's where I was able to blend my experience working in film for all these years with his experience in politics and those networks and really have something that would make sense, because then he could go to those investors and I could go to them and say, I've got the film experience, he's got the politics experience, and we can make something that's going to make sense. It's a meshing. And as I said earlier, every film is different, but in the case of this particular film, that was what made sense to those investors.
I know you've got another film in the works. You said you can't really talk about it,
Yeah.
but is this something where, without breaking any confidentiality, is this something where a studio may greenlight you soon, or is this something where you're going to approach a studio? Tell me as much as you can about that. Just curious.
I can't talk too much about it yet, but my next project is going to be a studio project. It will be my first studio project, and I'm very excited about that. But in that case, we're packaging it and then taking it out to the various A-list distributors, if you will, with the backing of a studio, which is a very different process. When you're doing an independent film, it is about having the concept, having the materials, having the team. When it's a studio-based project, it's about having all of those things signed off on in advance before you take it out to those places, because it's a different form of investment. Studios do have the money to do it, but they're not going to take the risk on something that an independent financier might. They need to make sure that all of your T's and I's are crossed and dotted. So having all of those things ready to go within the pitch, having all of those attachments ready, that is a very different process for sure.
And that's all packaged through a big agency, correct?
That is correct. And that's packaged through an agency. And so in the case of that project, I'm represented by one of the agencies, and the agency does the bundling for those type projects. Yes.
Awesome. Little out of scope of this show, but just glad to hear.
It's a good question because it's a very different process than independent film. And I think that for anyone that is interested in making that jump from independent film to studio work, it is really important to recognize what those differences are, because you have the freedom of not having to fundraise, which is a great thing. But if in order to have that freedom, you have to have some other things together that you may not have to have together for an independent investor. So it's a very different process.
Yeah, well, I wish you all the best on that. So in terms of the American question, where can people now see the film?
You can see The American Question on Tubi and every VOD platform you can think of, from Amazon to Apple to Fandango and Google Play and YouTube.
Awesome, awesome. I highly recommend people seeing it. I've kind of gotten tired of so many political documentaries, but this one's very refreshing, and it answers a lot of questions, and I think it was very, very well done. So I highly recommend seeing, especially on a place like Tubi. If people want to follow you, what is the best way people can contact you or follow you? You have social media?
Yeah, I'm on all social media platforms at James Kick, JamesKick, and my website is jameskicklighter.com. And from there, you can find all of my different work and how to contact me through various platforms.
Awesome, James. So much. Thank you so much for coming on the show. What would your final parting words of advice be to a filmmaker, maybe on their first project, trying to raise a couple 100,000, or maybe their second film where they're stepping up to a 500,000 or $1 million budget on the fundraising?
I would say the hardest part is keeping yourself motivated, because sometimes it takes time to put those money pieces together, those investment pieces together, and you have to be persistent. It's hard work. Don't give up. Keep pushing. Because if you want to build a career, it's not just about that first film. I think many filmmakers, especially in their early stages, think about, well, if I just get this one film done, everything's going to work out for me. But that's not really true. To have a career, you have to be able to make the one film and the next film and the next film and the next film. And so I think it's very important to think about your career as building blocks. How will this film help me get to the next place I want to go? And once I get to that place, how do I get to the next one? It's much easier to think about your career in those roadblocks than thinking about them as individual projects. And that, I think, helps keep you motivated to get that work done.
Well, James, I couldn't have summed it up better. Coming from a small town of 123 people in Georgia to being an LA producer with a big agency, getting ready to do your first studio project, you're a real inspiration. Thank you for your time today.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
It's time!
There's never been a better time to make your own film. And if you have a dream project you're excited about and 100% committed to getting it funded, go to financeyourmovie.com, click on the green telephone, you'll see our calendar and find an open spot. We'll do a one-on-one call, which will be the best hour you've ever spent getting clarity and strategy towards financing your movie.